Stewart up for 5 minutes. Mr. Stewart. Oh, Mr. Stewart's not. Yeah, there you are. There you are.
I'm here. Yeah.
Good to see you, Jake.
Sorry. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I've got a couple of questions that I'm going to ask a few different panelists, and for the most part, I think it's just yes or no answers. I'll start with Mr. Perot. Scotiabank recently released a report that among all G7 countries, Canada came in dead last when it comes to housing supply per capita. Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you. How many homes do we need to add to our market just to catch up with the rest of the G7?
About 1.8 million.
Thank you. Earlier, I mean, I'm not an economist, but like you, but it's safe to say that when the supply is low and the demand is so high that the price of a home will be higher. Would you agree with that statement?
Absolutely.
Earlier, you made a comment early in your discussion that, and this is just a point of clarification, but earlier when you began, you said that this problem was a made in Canada problem. But then near the end of you were questioned by another member, and it seemed that your stance changed a little bit. It seemed more that, the opinion of economists changed over the last year and a half, which I believe you said, and I believe that to be true. But I'm just wondering, the ballooning housing crisis here in Canada, it seemed like you told one of the members here that it was a global phenomenon, but early in your introduction, you said that it was a made in Canada problem. Could you just clarify
sure.
just how much of this actually is a made in Canada problem?
So yeah, apologies if I led anybody to confusion. So on the housing thing, I think this is a uniquely made in Canada issue. The point about it being broader than a Canadian issue was related to inflation and some of the inflationary dynamics, but housing, I suppose you could argue that the decline in long-term interest rates around the world, which occurred in the pandemic, contributed to the housing situation here, but fundamentally, not building enough homes, that's our problem.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Question now for Professor Hayter. In comparison to the 1970s, how many homes are built today in Canada?
Thank you for the question. I think around that time, we were building
Mr. Hayter, and I apologize if you could just raise your mic a little bit. Yeah, just your voice a little low. If we just want to be able to hear you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me correctly. Earlier, we were building something around 300,000 homes, and not just any homes. Even in Ontario, there were 40,000 residential rental units were being built. And those numbers declined over the years. Right now, we are in the range of between 275 to 300,000 homes built every year. But given that we have a very large population base compared to the one that was in 70s, in relative terms, this becomes a very slow or small supply.
So would you say that we're building about half as many homes as we did?
Not in absolute terms, but in terms of number of homes built per capita, yes. The rate of construction is almost half.
Thank you. Also, Mr. Hayter, when Justin Trudeau took power, the typical home costed $434,500, now $811,700. Over 85% inflation in 6 years under the Trudeau regime. Last year alone, home inflation hit 25%. Is it fair to say that we have a housing supply crisis right now in Canada?
We do have a housing supply crisis in Canada.
Thank you, Mr. Hayter. Last question to you, sir. In terms of how has ultra low mortgage rates impacted home sale prices in this country?
The way ultra low home mortgage rates affect is that the monthly mortgage payment becomes smaller, which means that the homeowners or prospective home buyers are able to purchase larger value homes because their monthly mortgage payments are low, and that is the reason that they move or gravitate towards higher priced homes. So that contributes to a little bit of housing price inflation.
Thank you. Appreciate your question. Mr. Chair, how much time remaining?
We've got about 25 seconds.
Housing inflation is homegrown in Canada. Bloomberg reports Canada has the second most inflated housing bubble in the world. The average family must spend 2/3 of their gross income in places like Toronto and Vancouver, where they're ranking second and fifth on planet Earth. I'd just like to say again, thank you to Mr. Perot for also chiming in. But yes, this housing ballooning in Canada is homegrown and caused by the Trudeau government.
Liberal government should be working to unite Canadians, not silence them. So this liberal censorship is coming, according to this tweet. A new internet regulation bill could spark even more outrage than C10, according to none other than Heritage Mr. Stephen. Gilbert.
Ms. Zarowitz for 5 minutes. My apologies.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I'm just going to start off with a couple of statements. There was an earlier comment about why don't we just deal with the demand side and just slow down immigration. Just want to make 3 comments on that. Immigration, as we know, is key to Canada's economic growth. It always has been. It's also key because we have such huge demographic challenges, so huge number of people retiring and a very low birth rate. And especially right now, we have a huge labor shortage issue across this country. And so we really do need to keep the demand side up. So I want to make sure I address that. There was a comment that was made around sort of more targeted and widespread sort of support during this pandemic. Starting last summer, it wasn't at C2, starting last summer, we actually started targeting the support towards very more specifically. And we did it very, very deliberately. And we have been continuing to target our support as we move along. And I do want to sort of point out that even after we introduced our fall economic statement, we continued to have our AAA credit rating internationally confirmed. And so to me, that shows some confidence in terms of how it is that we're going about spending and how it is that we're proposing to continue to support our economy coming out of this pandemic. Mr. Perot, I'm going to sort of address my first question, just because the narrative here is that over the last 2.5 years, the actions of the Trudeau government in trying to urgently address and support the Canadian economy has led to the housing problem and the housing crisis and the housing inflation that we have today. Would you say that the housing inflation that we have now, and maybe the housing crisis that we have right now, has been a 30 to 40 year problem in the making? So it's been a number of things, whether it's tax changes, whether it is lack of coordination or efforts along all 3 levels of government, whether it is, the different levels of government not supporting some sort of a national housing strategy. Would you say that would be a true statement?
I think it's fair to say that the housing challenge in the country is not new. It's been perhaps turbocharged the last number of years because of population growth. But it is certainly not a new phenomenon, and it is not unique to any level of government in the country. Okay.
And I think that and so you would say it's more than just the last, so you said population growth, but you'd say that that's something that over the last 10, 20 years, or would you say it's more recent, like the last 2 to 5 years?
Well, certainly since 2015, we've seen a tremendous increase in immigration, which I think is fantastic. I mean, I'm unreformed pro-immigration on that front. The challenge has been that strength in immigration has led to very rapid population growth relative to what we've been experiencing the last 20 years or so. And that, I think, kind of amplified some of these stresses in the supply and the delivery of housing supply across the country.
Okay. Okay, you had mentioned in your remarks earlier, although I would say just to that comment, Mr. Perot, I do believe that there has been a shortage of attention that's been made on housing, on rental housing in terms of, and more housing at all 3 levels. And I do think that needs to be put on the record as well. And it's not just the population growth. I think there was just sort of different levels of government not really focused on ensuring that we had an adequate number of housing supply as we were growing our population. Would you say that that's true?
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to 2016, which is kind of too early in the population boom, our level of housing in Canada, again, if you compare it internationally, it was very, very low relative to population.
Okay.
So, like it's worse now, but it wasn't great 5-6 years ago.
You had mentioned that we may have to change sort of legislative structure because NIMBYism is definitely a problem. In your view, what are the main things that provinces and municipalities should do immediately to help overcome some of these NIMBYism problems and build some more housing?
That to me is a political question more than an economic question. I think the economics are pretty straightforward. Like it's in everybody's interest to make sure that we right sizing housing and proper densification, all this kind of stuff. If there are financial constraints or considerations that are delaying that or making that more difficult in municipalities or provinces, I think that can be addressed. But I think at the heart of it is simply kind of political challenges in how municipalities want to deal with, and province to some extent, with the fact that populations are rising, and that is forcing some pretty difficult choices on the part of local politicians.
Thank you, and thank you, Ms. Zarowitz. That is the time. We are moving to the block, and Monsieur Trudel for 2.5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Madame Laflamme, we've established the fact that the government has been investing funds, but it doesn't lead to housing more vulnerable people. We talked about the RHI.